There's no pipe here, no tank, nothing connected. And yet by morning, water collects quietly in this container as if it came from nowhere. No rain touched the ground overnight. No hidden source is feeding it. No electricity is powering anything behind the scenes. It simply appears, slowly, drop by drop, as if the environment itself is giving something back. If you walked past this without knowing what was happening, you would assume there must be something underneath it, some connection you can't see, but there isn't. What you're looking at is something far more ordinary, and at the same time, something most people have never truly understood. The air around you right now is not empty. It may feel dry, invisible, and still, but it is carrying something incredibly valuable. Tiny particles of water are suspended in it at all times, moving with every shift in temperature, every breeze, every change between day and night. You don't notice it because your eyes are not designed to see it in that form. It stays hidden, blending into the background of your daily life, quietly existing without ever demanding your attention. And because it doesn't demand attention, it rarely receives any. But the moment the conditions change, the moment that invisible moisture meets the right surface, at the right temperature, everything shifts. What was unseen begins to reveal itself. It gathers, forms, and becomes something real, something you can touch, collect, and use. The process is simple, almost effortless, yet it feels surprising when you witness it intentionally for the first time. Not because it's complicated, but because no one ever pointed it out clearly. You've experienced this effect many times without thinking about it. A cold glass sitting on a table begins to sweat. Metal surfaces feel damp early in the morning. Leaves carry a thin layer of moisture before the sun rises high enough to dry them. These are not random events. They are signals. Quiet, consistent reminders of what the air is holding. But without context, they pass by unnoticed, just small details in the background of everyday life. What changes everything is not the environment. It's your awareness of it. The moment you recognize that this moisture is always present, always available, and simply waiting for the right conditions to appear, your perspective shifts. You stop seeing air as empty space and begin to see it as something active, something carrying potential that has always been there. And once you see it this way, you begin to understand that access doesn't always come from adding more. Sometimes it comes from noticing what already exists. This realization is quiet, but it's powerful. It doesn't rely on technology or complicated systems. It doesn't require permission or infrastructure. It's based on something much simpler: understanding how natural processes behave when you stop ignoring them. And when you begin to understand that, you no longer feel limited by what you don't have. You start working with what's already around you, using it in ways that most people never consider. That's the shift, not in the air, not in the environment, but in how you see it. What you're seeing here isn't new at all. It may feel unfamiliar because it's rarely explained in a clear way, but the process itself has been understood and used for a very long time. Long before modern systems, long before pipes, pumps, and constant access to treated water, people had to pay close attention to their surroundings. They learned to observe patterns, to notice how the environment behaves under different conditions, and to use those patterns to meet basic needs. In places where water wasn't easily available, this wasn't optional. It was necessary. In dry regions where rainfall was unpredictable, communities found ways to capture moisture from the air itself. In coastal areas where fog would roll in regularly, people created simple structures that allowed that fog to leave behind droplets they could collect. In mountainous environments, surfaces were shaped and positioned in ways that encouraged condensation to form naturally during cooler parts of the day and night. None of this required advanced technology. It came from careful observation and a willingness to work with natural processes instead of trying to control them. The surprising part isn't that this works. The surprising part is how little attention it gets today. As systems became more centralized and convenient, the need to understand these methods slowly faded. Water started coming from taps, controlled and delivered through infrastructure most people never think about. Over time, that convenience replaced awareness. Knowledge that was once practical became something distant, something that existed in specific regions or older practices, but wasn't part of everyday thinking anymore. Either the signs of this process never disappeared. They are still present all around you, showing up in small, familiar ways. A glass filled with a cold drink begins to collect moisture on its surface, even in a closed room. Metal objects left outside overnight develop a thin layer of water by morning. Grass and leaves feel damp before the sun rises high enough to warm them. These are not isolated events. They are consistent patterns that happen because the air interacts with surfaces in a very specific way. What's happening in each of these situations is the same underlying process. The air carries moisture in a form you can't see. When that air comes into contact with something cooler, it changes state. The moisture can no longer stay suspended, so it gathers and becomes visible. It forms droplets, and those droplets settle on the surface. It's simple, predictable, and happening constantly whether you pay attention to it or not. The reason it often goes unnoticed is because it feels ordinary. It doesn't stand out. It doesn't demand an explanation. It's just there, part of the background. But once you begin to look at it more closely, you start to see that it's not random at all. It follows clear rules, it happens under specific conditions, and most importantly, it can be guided. That's the key difference. Instead of letting it happen passively, you can begin to create conditions where it happens in a controlled and useful way. The same effect you see on a glass or on grass can be scaled, directed, and collected. What used to seem like a minor detail becomes something you can work with intentionally. This shift doesn't come from discovering something new. It comes from recognizing something that was always there and understanding it properly. Once you connect those small, everyday observations to the larger process behind them, everything starts to make more sense. You begin to realize that the environment is constantly offering opportunities, but they only become useful when you understand how to engage with them. So this isn't about learning a trick or following a trend. It's about reconnecting with a way of thinking that focuses on observation, simplicity, and awareness. The knowledge itself hasn't disappeared. It's still visible in the same places it always was. The only thing that changed is how often people stop to notice it. There's a specific moment when air reaches its limit. It can only carry a certain amount of moisture at a given temperature. And when that balance shifts, something changes. As the air cools down, its ability to hold on to that invisible water decreases. When it comes into contact with a surface that is cool enough, it can no longer keep that moisture suspended. There is nowhere left for it to stay in that form, so it transitions. It releases itself from the air and becomes visible, forming tiny droplets on that surface. This is not random or unpredictable. It follows a clear and consistent rule that happens again and again under the right conditions. Those droplets are extremely small, almost unnoticeable, but they don't stay that way. As more moisture is released, those tiny points begin to connect with each other. They merge, grow heavier, and start to take shape. Once they reach a certain size, gravity begins to influence them. Instead of staying in place, they start to move. Each slowly at first, then more clearly as they gather more weight. What began as something invisible becomes something you can actually see, something you can collect. What you are doing here is not creating water. You are not generating anything new. You are simply guiding a natural process that is already happening around you. You are giving that invisible moisture a surface where it can transition into a usable form. Without that surface, the process still exists, but it happens in small, scattered ways that are difficult to collect. By introducing the right conditions, you make that process visible, controlled, and useful. The simplicity of this is what makes it powerful. There is no need for machines, no requirement for electricity, no complex engineering involved. You are not forcing anything to happen. When you are allowing something to happen more efficiently, a properly placed surface becomes the point where the air interacts in a predictable way. The goal is not to complicate the setup, but to position it so the environment does the work for you. The surface itself plays an important role. It needs to be something that encourages droplets to form and stay long enough to grow. If it is too smooth, water may not collect effectively. If it is too loose or uneven, droplets may not gather properly. A material with a fine texture creates more points where condensation can begin. Each tiny point becomes a starting place where moisture can appear, and the more of these points you have, the more efficient the process becomes. Angle also matters. When droplets form, they need a path to follow. If the surface is completely flat, water tends to sit and spread out instead of moving. This slows everything down and reduces how much you can actually collect. But when the surface is tilted slightly, every droplet that forms naturally moves downward. It doesn't need help. Gravity takes over and guides it to a single direction, making it easier to gather at the bottom. Air movement is another key factor. Still air holds moisture, but it doesn't continuously supply it to the surface. When air flows across or through the surface, it constantly brings new moisture into contact with it. This keeps the process active. Instead of relying on a limited amount of air, you are working with a continuous flow, which increases the amount of water that can form over time. The larger the surface area, the greater the effect. More surface means more contact points, more droplets forming at the same time, and more water being produced overall. It's not about increasing complexity, but about increasing opportunity. A wider surface gives the air more chances to release what it's carrying, and that directly affects how much you collect. Everything here is based on simple interaction: air, temperature, surface, and movement. When these elements come together in the right way, the process becomes steady and reliable. It doesn't require constant attention or adjustment. Once set up properly, it continues on its own, following the same natural pattern every time the conditions are right. Understanding this changes how you approach the entire idea. Instead of thinking about creating something from nothing, you begin to see it as working with what already exists. The water was always there, was just not in a form you could use. By guiding the conditions, you allow it to transition into something practical. That's all this is. Not invention, but alignment with how the environment already behaves. What makes this work isn't complexity, it's how simply and correctly you set it up. You don't need heavy materials or complicated designs. A basic frame is enough, something light that can stand on its own and hold a surface tightly in place. It could be made from wood, PVC, or anything you already have that can form a stable rectangle. The goal is not to build something perfect, but to create a structure that can support a stretched surface without sagging or shifting. The surface itself is where everything happens. This is more important than the frame holding it. You want a material that has a fine texture, not too smooth, however not too loose. Something like a tightly woven mesh or cloth works well because it gives moisture a place to form. When air touches this kind of surface, tiny droplets begin to appear and hold on just long enough to grow. If the material is too open, the air passes through without enough contact. If it's too slick, the droplets don't form properly. The right texture creates balance, allowing moisture to gather and combine into larger drops. Tension is also important. The material should be pulled tight across the frame, not hanging loosely. When it's tight, the surface stays consistent and droplets can move more smoothly across it. If it sags, water can collect in uneven spots, slowing down the process and reducing how much you actually gather. A firm, stretched surface allows everything to flow naturally once droplets begin to form. One of the most common mistakes happens in how people position the setup. Many assume placing it flat will work best, but that actually limits the entire process. When the surface is flat, water tends to sit and spread out, and as temperatures rise, it disappears before you ever get the chance to collect it. You need a slight angle, not steep, just enough so gravity can guide every droplet downward as soon as it forms. This small adjustment makes a big difference. It turns scattered moisture into a steady flow that can be directed and gathered. The angle doesn't have to be exact, but it should be consistent. Think of it as creating a path for water to follow. Every droplet that forms should naturally move toward the same direction, without needing any extra force. When the setup is angled correctly, the process becomes continuous. Moisture forms, combines, moves downward, and collects, all on its own. Air movement plays a major role as well. This setup doesn't rely on still air sitting in one place. It works best when air is constantly moving across the surface. As air flows through, it brings new moisture into contact with the material. This keeps the process active instead of slowing down after a short time. Without airflow, you're working with a limited amount of moisture. With airflow, you're working with a constant supply. Placement becomes important here. You want to position the frame where it can catch natural airflow, not block it. Open areas, slightly elevated positions, or spots where you can feel a light breeze tend to work better. The goal is to let the environment do the work for you, not to force the process. Even a small amount of movement in the air can make a noticeable difference over time. Timing also matters more than people expect. Setting this up before the temperature drops allows the surface to adjust naturally as conditions change. As the air cools overnight, the process becomes more active. By morning, the results are visible. If you place it too late or disrupt it too often, you reduce the amount you can collect. Everything here comes down to small adjustments that work together. A simple frame, the right material, proper tension, a slight angle, and good airflow. None of these are complicated on their own, but when combined correctly, they create a system that runs without effort. You're not forcing anything to happen. You're setting the conditions so it can happen naturally, in the most efficient way possible. And now set it up before sunset. Leave it undisturbed. By morning, what was invisible becomes something you can hold. Some nights it's a small amount. Other nights, especially in humid conditions, it's enough to make you pause and rethink what's actually possible. And once you see it work even once, it changes something. Because you realize this wasn't hidden behind technology or locked behind cost. It was always happening, quietly, in the background of your environment. If you want to take it further, you can filter what you collect using simple layers. Something to catch particles, something to absorb impurities, something to refine the flow. It doesn't require complexity, just intention. The air around you is not empty. It's carrying resources that most people ignore because they've been trained to rely on systems instead of understanding processes. But when you start seeing these patterns, you stop looking for solutions outside and start building them from what's already present. You don't need more access. You need a different way of seeing, and once you notice it, you can't unsee it.